Meyer Lansky died in January of 1983. The system he built did not. This is not a metaphor. The specific financial architecture that Lansky constructed across 6 decades of patient, precise work, the offshore accounts, the shell corporations, the layered jurisdictional structures, the mechanisms for moving money across borders in ways that made it legally untraceable, did not disappear when he died. It evolved, it was adopted, it was refined by people who had access to significantly more resources than Lansky ever had, and who operated in an environment that, paradoxically, made his methods not more difficult to use, but considerably easier. The irony is considerable. Lansky built his financial architecture in an era when the tools were primitive, and the legal frameworks designed to combat them were even more primitive. He worked with physical cash, with face-to-face relationships, with handshake agreements in hotel rooms. He moved money through Swiss banks at a time when Swiss banking secrecy was absolute, and international financial cooperation between law enforcement agencies was essentially non-existent. By the time he died, the world had changed. The Bank Secrecy Act of 1970 had created mandatory reporting requirements for large cash transactions. International cooperation on financial crime had begun to develop institutional form, the tools that federal investigators had been denied. Throughout Lansky's operational years were beginning to exist, and yet the offshore financial system that Lansky pioneered did not contract in the years after his death. It expanded enormously, systematically, and with the active participation of institutions, banks, law firms, accounting firms, registered agents that had no connection to organized crime in any traditional sense. The Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, Panama, Delaware. The infrastructure they built serves the same purpose Lansky's system served: money, legally separated from the person who controls it. Lansky understood, before almost anyone else in his world, that the gap between owning something and controlling something was the most important gap in any legal system. You do not need to own an asset to benefit from it. You need only to control it through a sufficiently opaque chain of intermediary entities that, connecting your name to the asset, requires more legal and investigative resources than any practical prosecution can sustain. Today, this understanding is not the exclusive possession of organized crime. It is the operating principle of a significant portion of the global financial system. The Panama Papers, released in 2016, provided the most comprehensive public documentation of how this system actually operates in the modern era. 11.5 million documents from a single Panamanian law firm revealed the offshore financial arrangements of hundreds of thousands of individuals and entities across the world. Politicians, business people, celebrities, criminals, and a substantial number of people who were simply wealthy and preferred that their wealth not be easily visible. What the Panama Papers showed was that the offshore financial system is not a fringe phenomenon used exclusively by criminals. It is a mainstream financial service used by mainstream clients through mainstream intermediaries. The lawyers and accountants who maintain shell corporations in the British Virgin Islands are not criminals. They are service providers, doing for their clients exactly what those clients pay them to do. The system works because it was designed to work. Not by Lansky. The modern offshore financial infrastructure is far more sophisticated than anything he had access to. But according to the same fundamental principle, that money, properly structured, can be made legally invisible to people who have every theoretical right to see it. Consider what this means in practice. A person or organization that generates revenue it would prefer not to declare can move that revenue through a series of shell corporations across multiple jurisdictions, each one a legal entity in good standing, each one serving no purpose except to be the next step in a chain that leads eventually to an account or asset that is effectively impossible to connect to the original source. The individual steps in this chain are, in many cases, legal. The overall structure may not be. The difficulty of proving that the overall structure is illegal, when each component is formally compliant with the laws of its jurisdiction, is precisely the difficulty that Lansky exploited for 60 years with far cruder tools. Wall Street understood this too, not in the criminal sense, but the same. Structures that protected criminal revenue are used daily by entirely legitimate financial actors. The line between these uses of the offshore infrastructure and Lansky's use of it is not always as clear as either the financial industry or law enforcement would prefer. The structure is the same. The purpose differs. Proving which purpose is being served requires exactly the kind of investigation that the structure is designed to defeat. The American real estate market has become, in recent decades, one of the primary vehicles through which money of uncertain origin enters the legitimate economy. All cash purchases of high-value properties in Manhattan, Miami, and Los Angeles by shell corporations, whose beneficial owners are not publicly disclosed, have been documented by investigative journalists and government reports across the last 2 decades. A significant proportion of the purchases examined involve owners who would prefer not to be identified. Lansky laundered money through casinos and offshore accounts in an era when this required personal relationships, physical cash, and considerable operational complexity. Today, the same goal can be achieved by purchasing a condominium through a Delaware LLC whose registered agent asks no questions about the source of the funds. The tool has been democratized. The principle is unchanged. The Russian organized crime networks that expanded dramatically after the collapse of the Soviet Union understood this quickly. The financial architecture that had been developed across decades of offshore financial innovation was immediately available to organizations generating enormous revenues and needing ways to move and protect those revenues across borders. They used it extensively. The specific mechanisms they used were not fundamentally different from what Lansky had used, except that they had access to electronic transfers and international banking networks that Lansky could not have imagined. Lansky built a system for criminals. The system turned out to be useful for everyone. This is perhaps the most unsettling legacy of his career. Not the casinos, not the skim, not the 40 years of federal pursuit. The most unsettling legacy is that the financial architecture he developed proved to be so fundamentally useful that it was adopted by the global financial system at large, stripped of its criminal connotations, dressed in the language of tax efficiency and wealth management, and made available to anyone who could afford the service. Meyer Lansky did not create the modern offshore financial system, but he demonstrated, 6 decades before the Panama Papers, that such a system was possible, that the gap between owning and controlling, properly exploited, could make any amount of money legally invisible. The investigators who spent their careers trying to prove what they knew about Lansky found walls everywhere they turned. Today, those walls are a global industry, generating billions of dollars in professional fees for the lawyers and accountants who maintain them. Lansky would have recognized the system immediately. He built the prototype. The world built the rest.